Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our final lecture for this semester. Before I begin, a couple of quick things. First of all, office hours are, as I said over the email, are on for this week as well as for next week. In terms of meetings, so today is our last video, so the last virtual meeting. Friday will be our last in-person meeting. So if you're interested to come to the Friday meeting, you're more than welcome to do that. And one more reminder, as I said on the email, I think on Monday, if you are a little bit mixed up or a little bit confused in terms of your attendance record and you need to ensure which lectures you missed, which lecture you already sent me the attendance word, so you can log in during office hours this week or next week, and I can give you exactly the dates that I haven't had any kind of a record from you about whether you watch the lectures or not. So just a couple of things about that. All right, let me share my screen with you. There it is. Quick reminder about Monday, I talked about technological innovation, modern technology, and how that relates to different processes that takes place in the context of international system, primarily everything we talked about, different theories of IR. We talked about the potential escalation effects of development of new technology, and the research primarily has shown us that technology does not serve as a factor that leads to escalation. It only enable escalation, which is a result of mostly a political or strategic decisions by policymakers. And then we went and then we moved to talk about different types of technological innovation and how they affect foreign policy overall. We talked about drones, the main questions of efficiency versus the potential blowback. We talked about public views of drones, and in the context of once we integrate the idea of violation of international laws, then the public support for using drones is not as high as it is. We talked about more advanced types of technologies with the AWS, the Advanced Weapon System, and how that comes into play, again, with the context of public opinion. While on one hand, we can say the problems of weapon system which are not controlled by humans overall may be a problem for us from a normative standpoint, from a legal standpoint. But then once we take under consideration issues related to costs or effectiveness, then public opinion actually is more open to it. And then I finished with a discussion about the different aspects of cyber technology. We talked about the potential, we talked about the limitations, and finish up with the user error as one of the main incentives for perpetrators to engage or to use those kinds of tools, cyber tools, to try to create as much damages as possible for us. So if you have any more questions about that, if you write your final project on this topic, you're more than welcome to email me, come talk to me during office hours, etc. All right, a final topic for the semester, it's covert action in the context of IR. We'll address different aspects of covert operations that states are engaged in and how that fits within different theories of IR, different concepts of IR. States may use covert acts of military coercion by engaging in secret, plausibly deniable action in order to address security threats on the ground or different political situations. These actions are not new, and over the last 20 years, as part of the global war on terrorism, has become a lot more of a central aspect of foreign policy that states are engaging, especially the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and other countries that are in Western Europe. And the research on that topic has expanded similarly over the last 20 years. We have here some of the more known covert operatives, if you're familiar with. So I'm not talking about James Bond, which you're probably familiar with. It's a fictional character, of course. Down here we have Eli Cohen, which was an Israeli spy, operated in the early 1960s in Syria. He was able to collect very high level of intelligence about the political and strategic actions that the Syrian regime has planned at the time. He was caught and killed by the Syrian regime after he was caught. And here we have several of the members of the SEALs unit that was caught. If you're familiar with the book or the movie about lone survivor, so those are members. Some of the people that you have here in the picture are members of that unit. They were engaged in different types of covert operations as part of the American war on terrorism in Afghanistan. Okay, so What are covert action? Also called the quiet option or the third option. They're usually viewed as an alternative to conventional forms of diplomacy or direct military action. It is a set of activities conducted by one element of a government in order to influence political, economic, and military conditions abroad, so that the role of the initiating government will not be apparent and there'll be no public acknowledgement of the action. So if the United States engages in that, the action is supposed to be kept in secret, so it's going to be unrelated to the American government. Covert action in many cases are mixed or confused with what also is called as a clandestine or clandestine operations. Unlike clandestine operations, covert actions are more controversial. They're not publicly acknowledged. In some cases, they're even actively denied by the government. On the other hand, the clandestine operations are undertaken in secret, but this is out of technical necessity. And in most cases, they are acknowledged by the government ex post. So after the operation is done, and primarily when it is successful, the government which initiated the operation will acknowledge its involvement in that. So that's the difference between those two terms. There's many different motivations to engage in covert actions. For example, avoiding from angering the domestic or the global audience because of different types of foreign policy actions that I want to engage in. Other motivations include reducing the risks of triggering unwanted escalation. If I want to engage in some action, I don't want to get into escalation with my target or my rival. I may think about engaging in covert action. So those are some of the motivations. This figure is from one of the papers you had in your reading links for today. This is the American covert intervention during the Cold War in different countries around the world. We have here some of the interventions that were intended to support existing leaders. We have here interventions that were intended to install new leaders. But overall, we see a not insignificant, in some cases, you can also say high number of American actions only, and that's just in the more restricted time of the Cold War. Some background on these policy actions. Covert actions have been prevalent policy of the American government since early in the 19th century. Many American presidents at the time relied on those kinds of actions to consolidate the territory of the growing new country at the time. For example, President Madison used those kinds of tools in Spanish-occupied Florida in 1810, between 1810 and 1812. I talked about the Cold War. Some of the recent examples from primarily during this time, the intervention in Cuba also consists of the Bay of Pigs scenario, of course, Vietnam, Angola, and the American actions in Afghanistan in 1979 after the Soviet invasion. All those covered operations by the United States included, on some level, either a paramilitary operations or providing extensive assistance to insurgent groups which operated at those locations, such as the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. From a research standpoint, the early work focused on more of a descriptive approach, using historical case analysis to show the motivations of those kinds of actions and their implications. The more current research is focusing on the ever-present efficiency puzzle. For example, a 2013 research used data about American attempts to perform a covert regime change during the Cold War. The author had 63 cases in which the United States engaged in those kinds of operations. In most of those cases, there was not much of a success, and the actions that were initiated by the American government were directed at elected officials in the developing world. Other avenues of research, especially over the last decade or so, look at the relationship between covered policy and some of the different concepts or elements of IR theories. One example is the work by Professor Carson, who's an expert in the context of covered action. He's from the University of Chicago, and his 2016 research showed how covert intervention in wars allows states to exert influence while at the same time prevent unintended escalation. He illustrated his arguments with the Soviet actions, covert actions during the Korean War, and what can be defined as the silent response of the Western powers led by the United States. Essentially, what he shows there is that the Western powers led by the United States during the Korean War did not just fight against North Korean pilots at the time, but Soviet pilots were also part of those interactions, but they were kept hidden, and that allowed the Soviets still to exert their influence as part of the overall conflict of the Cold War, and at the same time not to engage in direct confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States and face the risk of escalating the Cold War. So that's part of the uses that we can look at for covert action, and therefore it provides benefits for both sides. Okay, so our focus today will be different, as I said, different elements of IR theories and how they relate to covert action. First, we'll talk about the work by Poznansky, who's a professor. He was in Pittsburgh. Now he's in the Naval War College, I think. And this study focuses on the democratic peace theory and how it relates to covert action. The main question here is, do states employ those kinds of actions, and why, against their fellow democracies? The basic challenge that he presents is that democratic states, there is evidence that democratic states do engage in covert actions against other democratic countries, and that creates a serious breach in the logic of the democratic peace theory and its main proposition. We can look at all those three elements here. For example, if you think about audience cost and the various structural constraints which I talked about in the context of democratic peace, why would democracies not engage in those kinds of actions? So that would lead us to expect that democracies will not engage in covert actions against one another. They will try to resolve their differences, whatever that may be, without any type of aggressive actions, covert or non-covert, but especially covert also because of the risks of audience cost in case of exposure and escalation risks. Another aspect that fits to democracies is the information, the free flow of information between democracies. And in that sense, it actually makes it more efficient to use covert actions against another democracies, because the free flow of information makes it a lot more risky to engage in a non-covered action against another democracy. So a covered action against other democracy from that standpoint is more likely, especially if the adversary, the other democracy, is relatively much weaker, and I think that my chances of success are relatively very, very high. Finally, we can also think about the aspects of the identity and the social cultural concerns when it comes to democracies, the shared identity, shared norms between democratic countries. So if we follow that logic, democracies should be restrained and not use covert actions against other democracies. At the same time, we can also use that logic to suggest that using covert action is more likely because that allows some form of intervention in the affairs of other democracies, which some countries do engage in, but still keeping within the boundaries of identity and social values. So the main point that he raises is that to think about or to explain that puzzle of how can we explain democracies engage in covert actions against one another, he suggests to look at regimes from a dynamic standpoint. For some states, for some democracies, it is not clear that they will be able to keep with this type of regime, especially when it comes to democratic regimes and the demands of a democracy, mostly the need to ensure regular competitive elections and the protection of basic civil rights and providing civil and political liberties to the citizens. So if there's uncertainty about the persistence of democracy, that's where this whole idea of using covert action comes into play. However, at the same time, this logic of looking at democracy from a dynamic standpoint does not explain why would one country prefer to use covert action, and that can be a function of the risk of reputational cost, questions about the legitimacy of overt action, and the legitimacy, it's from both the domestic as well as global standpoint. So his first point in trying to explain that, how does looking at regime types from using a dynamic approach will make using covert action more likely, is to introduce those two kind of concepts. He says that democracies, when we think about them from a duration standpoint over time, they follow those two potential avenues. One is what's called democratic decay. That is when the leaders or the decision makers in one democracy expect that their other democracy may break down in the future, and therefore they're more likely to prefer engage of covert action to change the regime. If I think that the other democracies, if let's take just two countries as an example, if the United States thinks that Ukraine is likely to not be a democracy in the future, that creates incentives for the leaders of the United States to engage in covert action to change the regime in Ukraine in order to ensure that they will remain a democracy. The other option is what's called democratic stasis, and that's when the decision makers expect the regime to remain a democracy, then all the constraints that were offered by the democratic peace will hold and no action is likely to be implemented. So using covert action will relate to how leaders will perceive the future trajectory of the regime of other states, in that case, other democracies. Now, because this is a perceptual element, it is also important to ensure that those views by decision makers are actually a function of strategic concerns and not just individual within the leader. The leader thinks that maybe Ukraine will not be a democracy. Okay, so let's engage in covert action. No, this should be a function of strategic conditions. So leaders' expectations of decay in democracies can be a response to multiple political developments. For example, the assumption of power by leaders who espouse anti-democratic ideology. So if now somebody in Ukraine takes power and that leader will display anti-democratic statements or ideology, then that may provide us with incentives or a logic to engage in covert regime change. Or if there are existing leaders and there is concern that they may lose power and they are threatened by radical alternatives, maybe that's another motivations for that. Those types of perceptions may push leaders of existing democracies to view decaying democracies in the future as non-democracies in the present. So again, based on our example, maybe the United States is concerned that Ukraine will be a decaying democracy in the future. So in that sense, that means that the United States now in the present views Ukraine as non-democracy. And if the United States also have a lot of incentives or a lot of stakes in issues related to everything that takes place, let's say in Eastern Europe, then it is more likely that it's going to create a lot of incentives for a democracy such as the United States to engage in covert regime change. The actions in that context may include support for a weak leader or strengthen the opposition if there's another conditions. There are more, we can call them severe types of actions when it comes to covert intervention that include supporting military coups or forceful regime change when the democracy that is in question is in the clear stage of decay. That's the argument here, right? So if I'm the leader of a democracy and I see another democracy, which I believe will decay in the future, that provides me incentives to engage in different forms of covert intervention and work to change the regime of that decaying democracy to ensure it's going to remain a democracy. That's how it fits into the idea of the democratic peace. So to test the theory, the author uses a process tracing method, and he looks at two historical cases. He looks at Iran in 1951 to 1953. And the second case, which I'm going to talk about, will be the events that took place in Chile in the 1970s, and focusing on the regime of Salvador Allende. So the American intervention at the time took place in two discrete time periods. First was everything that happens around the 1964 elections. In those elections, the winner was actually Eduardo Frei, which was the representative for the Democratic Party at the time. So he was able to secure the victory in 1964, but the Americans were mostly concerned about his rival, Allende, which represented the coalition of communist and socialist parties. And that was the main driver for the American actions before the elections and during that time. So the American assessment of Allende saw him as not as a supporter of democracy, and many of his public statements before the 1964 elections were the driver for that, because he mentions multiple types of revolutions, such as the one in Cuba, and that led to growing concerns in the United States regarding that if Allende is going to win the elections in 1964, that will be the end of democracy in Chile. So for the 1964 elections, the American engaged in covert intervention that was intended to ensure that Eduardo Frei, the leader of the Democratic Coalition, will emerge as the winner. And that included financial support for his party, engaging in different types of propaganda against the Communist Party. And some of those actions persisted even after the success in 1964 and were intended to secure his regime, the regime of Eduardo Frei. However, over time, this regime, the support for the regime within Chile has decreased. And as the 1970s elections came closer, the risk for Frei's victory increases. And indeed, Allende was able to secure the victory in the 1970 elections. And therefore, the United States, because of the situation deteriorated, turned to covert use of force, primarily cooperated with members of the military to initiate a coup after the elections. At that time, the American motivation to engage in covert action was to prevent any kind of criticism from the domestic audience in Chile and further increase any kind of nationalist sentiment towards Allende. However, the operation was unsuccessful, and in November of 1970, Allende was able to form his government. The Americans did not stop their actions, and they persisted in the pressure on the Allende regime. Eventually, they were able to successfully implement a coup in September of 1973, and Allende has killed himself while the military stormed the presidential palace while the coup was taking place. So again, this is just one historical example how, looking at democracy over time, the United States leaders at the time were very concerned about democracy in Chile decaying, so they engage in different forms of covert action. Okay, now I want to switch and talk about another aspect of that, and that's what are the different motivations to engage in covert action, not just in the context of democratic peace, but overall motivations that may lead some states to adopt these kinds of policy. So this is the work by Joseph and Poznansky as well. And they explore the conditions that make the use of covert actions more likely, especially facing the risk of escalation as a result of a covert action being a failure. So they begin from the argument, from the point that the appeal of the quiet option is that it promises to deliver success when it comes to foreign policies, and at the same time, make sure that leaders will not face the messy ramification of publicity, right? Because if we engage in covert action and we are successful, we are able to accomplish our goals, and we not pay any types of cost in that context. However, despite the many motivations to take or to enact covert policies, the main risk that it involves is that this kind of action will be exposed, will be no longer covered, and most of the benefits of a covert action will become no longer useful. When there are conditions that increase the odds of exposing a covert action, leaders may decide to engage in other types of action, an overt action, so not the covert action, or will decide to just abandon the intervention in the affairs of other states altogether. In order to present what are those conditions, what's going to lead to those higher probability of exposing a covert action, the authors focused on the target states and what they define, what's called the ICT, which is an acronym for Information and Communication Technology. The idea is that widespread access to ICT enables different elements within the target to witness the events unfold, collect credible evidence that can compromise any type of plausible deniability, which is one of the main benefits of covert action. Premature exposure is particularly likely when members of the government, when members of the media and citizens in the target states can communicate with one another and share that information. They talk about three central mechanisms that can lead to exposure or covert action. The first is internal leaks, and that is dissenters, it's not dissent, I'm sorry, dissenters within the government that initiates the covert action oppose to engaging that kind of policy and then going to leak the mission to the target states. And then because there's widespread information network there, that's not going to be possible to implement the covert action. Another possibility is that having powerful allies or powerful rivals that have extended intelligence capabilities, they will find out about the action, another risk for exposure. And third is a discovery by the target itself, whether it is civilian, whether it is members of the political system, whether it is members of the security and intelligence personnel, whatever it may be. And this third point is particularly interesting for us when you think about that in terms of the strategic calculations that leaders are engaged in when they weigh the potential benefits of a covert action versus the cost of engaging in those kinds of actions. So dense ICT, the idea is that countries that have dense ICT networks, so there's widespread network of sharing information and technology, they're helpful in reducing the barriers of coordination between members of the government, the media, and the citizens. And that increases the likelihood that a covert operation will be exposed. One reason is that it allows those local actors to communicate much quicker, and it's going to be a lot less expensive for them to communicate and share that information, again, making the exposure more likely, whether it originates from the media, goes to the public, and then goes to the political system, or the other way around. Also, more access to information makes citizens more informed, and greater awareness of those kinds of events increases the capacity of citizens in the target states to recognize any kind of suspicious activity and reject any kind of external intervention. So the more widespread the information and communication network is within a country, citizens are more aware of what does it mean that another state may interfere in our affairs, and that makes the likelihood of exposure much higher. Sorry about that. So when the target states have very dense network of information and communication technology, the likelihood of a covert operation will be lower. That's the main argument that they offer. And this is especially true when the covert intervention has the potential for high cost if exposure is more likely, including escalation risk, reputational damages, and the like. So to test the theory, the authors use data on covert intervention by the United States in an attempt to subvert a foreign regime over time. And they also account for different aspects or different elements of the ICT, the information and communications technology network. And overall, what they find, and we'll talk about those figures in a second, is that the United States is consistently less likely to pursue covert action relative to other types of actions as the level of ICT within the potential target states increases. And that's what you see here. We have here over time, we have here different types of the frequency of different types of intervention. We have the red line is the covered interventions, the green line is no intervention at all, and the gray line is overt intervention, so not a secret one. And what we see here that as the values of, here we have one value, it's the media index, which represents, again, one measure of ICT. We have telephone cabling per capita. As the levels of those factors is higher, it's more likely that the operations that the United States will be engaged in are either no intervention at all or over types of operation and not cover types. They also run a bunch of regression models to account for those different factors, and that's what you see here. We have here different elements within the ICT network, so television, telephone, radio, newspapers, distribution, and the like. And each one of those figures, what we see here is the comparison and the likelihood of types of policies that's going to be implemented, either no intervention at all compared to a covered action. And in the panel B here, we have an overt action versus the covered action. So in order to interpret those models, again, we have this zero line here, which represents no effect, and everything above zero is a positive. So if we want to interpret it, let's say the telephone factor here, we say that as the number of telephone in a country increases, which represents more dense ICT network, the probability of engaging in a non-intervention is higher compared to engaging in a covered intervention. Similarly, for overt, we also have that regarding the distribution of newspapers, number of televisions, which matters here, does not matter here, and the like. So overall, what we see here is that all those different elements or different factors that relate to information network, the more dense that network is, the probability of engaging in covered action is much lower. And that's kind of an important conditions to view that. Now, there's two important implications that comes out of that research. Number one, from a research standpoint on the whole topic of covered action in the context of foreign policy and international relations, it allows us to move beyond the focus that was mostly prevalent on the incentives to engage in covered actions, and also think about the factors that shape the choice to enable those actions from the cost component. So not just looking at the incentives of why should we engage in covered action, we should also think about what are the potential costs, or maybe why shouldn't we engage in covered action, or when we're less likely to engage in covered action. And second, it shows the effect that modern technology in that context should be viewed as kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it allows for easier execution of covert warfare, that is using drones, using cyber capabilities, using any types of technology allows us to engage more easily on some level in covered actions and ensure and get all the benefits of secret operations. At the same time, those same solutions, those same technological solutions also make it much easier to expose covered actions, whether that relies on mobile phones, which are a lot more common today, easier access to global networks. So one citizen which views something suspicious can use his mobile phone to record that suspicion, and within less than an hour, it can be spread throughout the country in online news, and a covered action, which was supposed to be successful and provide a lot of benefits, may become exposed. All that means that technology in that sense complicates plausible deniability. It provides the potential incentives again, but it also has the potential to derail that plausible deniability. Okay? All right, the last part of the discussion today will be, as I did in a lot of the previous topics, bringing the public opinion back into the discussion, and how does the citizens, how do individuals view those kinds of actions, because they're mostly, as we know, are engaged or originate from governments. And that's the work by Myrick, which was also on your reading list for today. And she explores public opinion and covered action in the sense of looking at a transparency angle. Her work addresses a crucial aspect in the sense of using covert operations in a democratic countries. And that is looking at how the public views those policies and how much does the public support that. And she begins from the argument that it seems that citizens oppose covert operations by the government, but there's not much of research in that topic. And that's what she wants to do. And what you have here on your screen is some pictures and some evidence from the Church Committee, which explored CIA covert operations during the Cold War at the time, the 1970s. So her work focuses on whether there is a transparency norm within democratic countries. That is, the public cares very much about leaders being transparent. Therefore, they will reject any type of secret operations. So the motivations, if there is such a thing as a transparency norm, is that the public will not accept secret actions by the government because we expect leaders to follow transparency. Now, why is this important? From the perspective of policymakers, their strategic decision to undertake covered actions also involves their assessment of what is the anticipated public response to the potential revelation of covered action, and the potential political cost that a leader will pay if a covered operation will be exposed. So that's part of their calculation. And second, from an academic or from research standpoint, our understanding of how democratic leaders behave in the context of IR in foreign policy is predicated on the fact that they are held accountable to their actions, for their actions, by the electorate, right? We talked about it a lot when we talked about democratic peace, primarily when I talked about audience cost. So public opinion will matter even if we're talking about secret foreign policy actions, and that's going to also have an effect on the calculus that leaders are engaged in before they decide whether to enact those kinds of policies or not. So before we go into her research, let's get some background on the topic of public views of secret or covert operations. So again, this is also from her work. This is public opinion polls from different decades, and how much does the American public support covert operations of different types compared to other types of operations. So we have here relatively very low support for CIA operations, covered CIA support for rebels in Nicaragua in the 1980s. We don't have much of a support in terms of sending the CIA as a covered operatives when it comes to the war on drugs in Colombia in the 1990s. And there's a lot more support amongst the public to overt actions such as sanctions or even do nothing, also compared to covered military action against Iran in the context of the nuclear program. So overall, we have a low support for covert operation amongst the American public as derived from those public opinion polls. The main drawback of those polls, is that we cannot identify the causes for these kinds of opinions. It's hard to establish causality just based on public opinions, because it is possible that low support for covert action will be because of demand for transparency, but it's also possible that it can be a function of the lower degree of effectiveness of those kinds of operations, or that overall the public does not accept those kinds of methods. So if those are the different options that we have to explain public opinion, we should focus on the expected outcomes of a policy and not just on the idea of transparency. So before we go into the results of the analysis, let's try to explore each one of those avenues separately. First, we'll talk about the transparency norm. So transparency in policymaking reflects the willingness of the government to release policy-relevant information. This is both an institutional feature of democratic governments as well as an important liberal norm. It's critical for issues accountability, and that creates clear tensions in the context of national security. Because if we want to expand national security of the United States, sometimes we may have to engage in policies that violate those kinds of norms of transparency. I talked about it a little bit, if you remember, when I talked about terrorism and civil liberties and those kinds of actions. Now, previous work also suggested that during the Cold War, the number of democracies in the world has increased. At the same time, there was vast expansion of innovation and new technologies. And all that led to increased demand for accountability from different nations around the world. So the citizens in those new democracies have higher demand for accountability, and all that led to the establishment of some form of international standards of transparency. So transparency is something which is not just for certain democracies or just for the United States. It's a prevalent norm which is accepted for many democracies around the world. At the same time, this idea of a transparency is not systematically studied among the public level. And the public should have different incentives for why they would demand those kinds of transparency from the government. First, is the public may believe that policy decisions in a democratic country should be made with public consent, and citizens should have the power to hold leaders accountable for their actions. That's basic democratic norms, right? And covert action are, by their name, by their definition, not known to the public, so they limit these kinds of mechanism. That provides an explanation. If I'm opposing covert action, that's the reason. In addition, no transparency allows deception and abuse of power by the government, primarily because the government has clear informational advantage over the public in the context of foreign policy. There is very wide asymmetry in the level of knowledge between how much the public knows about events that take place in foreign policy and how much do elites and members of the political system. So if there's no transparency, the elites, the members of the political system, may take advantage of that, right? So those are the two incentives of the public to push very hard for transparency from the government. Now, the alternative explanation is that public members care a lot more about the outcomes of the policy and pay less attention to any kind of normative commitments. So accountability, in that case, democratic accountability, is driven by the ends and not the means. So that means the citizens will care much less whether the policy is a covered action or an overt action or any other type of action. And support for that argument is based on previous research that has shown that the probability of success or the level of success or the victory in foreign policy actions are crucial elements in the way that citizens assess foreign policy actions. So that means that if the public cares more about success than about transparency, then the method that the governments use to implement the policy is less important than the outcomes. Now, other things that Myrick proposes as support for this mechanism, the idea of looking at the policy outcomes, is the different contextual factors and how they relate also, or how they contrast in some level the transparency norm. So one example was what she called the nature of the action. Military operations should be viewed or shouldn't be viewed as, so the public will be more opposing for covered military operation compared to other types of instruments, because military operations may involve casualties, and that should not be hidden from the public eye. Also, in the context of public disapproval, if citizens oppose a certain policy, they'll be even more upset if the government will try to employ it in secret, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with transparency, just the idea we disapprove of that policy overall, and if you try to do that in secret, we're not likely to support that. And finally, it's the point of efficiency. If there's a high level of public opposition to covered action, especially if the secret aspect of the policy will offer no benefits. So she employs 3 experiments in which her main test is whether the policy is covered or non-covered, and how the respondents to the survey, how does the public respond to that? And she also incorporates those 3 contextual elements. Before I go into her work, I want to stop for today's attendance word. The attendance word for today, that's our last attendance word for this semester, is the word final. Final is the attendance word for today. And before we are addressing the results of her research, I want to check and show you your views about covered action in the context of IR, which is the result of your third and final survey task. So the survey that you completed a couple of weeks ago replicated some aspects of her work, specifically focusing on the separation between covered action and non-covered action. So again, I did the same thing I did in the previous surveys. That means removing all of you that responded with a neutral response, I don't care very much, and then collapsing the support and non-support categories. And what we see here overall is that some of you read about an overt operation to support rebels against a dictator, and that was the level of approval for those actions. Some of you read about the same kind of operation, but this time it was covered. And as you can see, there was more opposition to that than support. And the covered secret one is those of you that read about the covered operation, and it's also stated that there was not much benefit in keeping it secret, but the government still decided to engage in a secret operation. So the level of disapproval was much higher. So overall, we see here that similar to what some of those public polls show us, and the earlier argument that Myrick starts with, the public overall, and in that case, you guys, oppose covered action. But she argues that the mechanism that explains that, of course, may not be transparency, but actually will be results, right? So in the second phase of those same of the experiment that you completed, I also provided you with information. Some of you read about a successful policy, some of you read about unsuccessful policy, and look what happens now. When a policy is successful, which is the red bars, which is at the bottom panel here, then all of a sudden, whether the policy is an overt policy, whether the policy is a covered policy, the level of approval is very, very high. In this case, again, if we go back here, you see 61% of disapproval for covered action. Now this covered action was successful. Now we have 60 level of support or approval for the action. And when the policy fails, then it doesn't matter if it's a covered action or a non-covered action, the level of disapproval would be much higher. So again, that provides us with additional evidence that the outcomes matter a lot more than the means, how the policy is implemented. You also read a scenario about a terrorism incident and how the United States are going to address that. And again, the results that you see on your screen here is after providing you with the information about the success, and you see overall the same trend in the results. A successful operation, whether it is a covered action or a non-covered action, is supported a lot more than an unsuccessful one. Here I just took the results of multiple scenarios and put them together. And if you read the paper, you also saw something similar that she did, and I'm going to get to that also in a minute. Overall, when the policy outcomes are successful, which is those two bars in those two plots, the approval, which is what we have on the y-axis in both of those figures, are much higher compared to unsuccessful one. And there's not much of a difference whether the policy was covered action, which is the red bars here, or non-covered action. The last scenario that you read about in your survey was whether there was evidence about public opposition. Some of you read that there is information for the government that the public opposes that different policy. And in that case, again, once the public does not accept the policy, it doesn't matter if it's being implemented as a covered action or as an overt action, the level of support is much lower compared to when there's not such information, because some of you just did not have that information. That's how the experiment was ran. So you can see here the difference in overt action, I think it's 83% level of approval when there's no information about public opposition, and it drops all the way to 33 level degrees of approval when we have that information. So the bottom line of your survey is that transparency matters, but results matters more. So what did she find? Here we are showing all her results in one set of plots. If we first focus on the top row in those three plots, we have the covered, and that's covered versus overt. And you can see that the factors here are negative, which means that the support for covered action is lower compared to overt action, which is similar to what you had in your survey. And we'll jump to the third point here, which is the success. Look what happens once she integrates the idea of a successful policy. Then support is much higher. There's a positive view of those policies, and it doesn't matter that it was covered with no advantage at first. Now it is successful, so it's supported. It was covered, so it was less supported early on, but now it is supported. All right? So this is also from her paper. Again, that's taking all the experiments and putting them together in one set of results. And as you can see here, the approval for the government action is much higher when the policy is successful. And it doesn't really matter if it is covered, which is the light gray area, or non-covered. So overall, these findings from her research, as well as your survey, suggest that members of the public care a lot more about the outcomes of the policy and less about issues of transparency, which overall suggests that the outcomes matters more than the process. Or as some sports broadcasters may say, what have you done for me lately? We care about what you did. We don't care how you did it, right? Okay, so with the help of Mr. Stark, I want to finish today's lecture. I want to finish actually all lectures for this semester and give you one last set of comments. Overall, I enjoyed this semester as much as it was possible to enjoy that, considering everything that was around us, the virtual format, which is, I know you're not a fan of, I'm not a fan of, but that's what we had. I hope you had some kind of fun as well. I also hope that everything that you learned this semester was useful, or at least some of it. that I was able to provide you some information about how our how our world operates, how different political systems interact with one another, what we expect to happen. And I was able to fill some of the gaps on historical events or recent events that took place. Now, this course involves a lot of material, and I tried not to make it too heavy in terms of material. There's a lot of things that we did not cover. And I hope it was successful to give you a lot of new things to think about, but at the same time, not too difficult to deal with. And I'll be very happy if you will share with me your opinion, which is my passive aggressive way to ask you once again to submit teaching evaluations. Your final project is not too far away. I will highly encourage you to use office hours to talk to me about that if you need my help. If you want to come to in-person meeting this week, we still have in-person meeting on Friday. You're more than welcome to come on Friday. We can talk about that. We will have office hours next week as well. So if you need help, don't wait to the last minute. Come and talk to me. Finally, if you're graduating this semester, then congratulations. And I hope you will enjoy your graduation. If you're not, if you're coming back next year, and even if you're not coming back next year, I hope you will have a relaxed and enjoyable summer, and a safe summer, of course, as we get better in terms of the overall situation in the world. With that, I am done for today, done for the semester, and I hope you enjoy that. And with that, I will say goodbye to you. Enjoy your summer. Bye, everyone.